word to wise. Grass only greener when it's fertilized. Gave them truth in these songs, they prefer to lies. Destiny beautiful, adrift in her purple lies. You can't see me, you Stevie. Wondering how I reach more evolutions than Evie and make it look easy.
What is up, Earth's mightiest subscribers? It's your boy Ernie, the Blerd Without Fear. Welcome back to the channel. Today's video, I'm gonna be telling you everything you probably missed in X-Men 97 Season 2, Episode 6, Danger.exe. Let's get right into it. So first and foremost, let's go ahead and get the early one out of the way. We get the introduction of William Stryker and the Purifiers. Now, I would be willing to give this one a little bit of grace on people, like if you are not familiar with the comics, maybe you're more familiar with just the X-Men movies that Fox had made over the years. I would forgive you if you only were familiar with hearing Stryker's name, but with a colonel in front of it, as opposed to Reverend. That's because in the comics, Stryker is both a former military veteran, but he is also a Reverend after his military service, and the Purifiers are his Christian nationalist anti-mutant regime. And the reason why this is important is because William Stryker is probably most famous for being a part of one of the most iconic X-Men story arcs of all time, God Loves, Man Kills. And while the Purifiers don't make a huge splash, or I didn't really intend that pun considering everything that goes on in this episode, but we're gonna own it. We're gonna go ahead and own that. But it seems like they're setting William Stryker up to have a bigger role in a future season. And if that's the case, to all my Craig Kyle and Chris Yoss new X-Men fans, get your tissues ready. We also get a very deep cut character who is right along for the ride, and you see a lot of her during the Purifier scene, but most people probably don't remember who she is. The woman standing next to Executioner during the Purifier segment is a woman who is only ever referred to as Anne, a woman who made her debut in God Loves, Man Kills. But it was a grand opening, grand closing situation. But she was one of William Stryker's diehards, like she was a true believer and was one of the main people you would see executing mutants in the name of the Purifiers. So it is interesting that she's included here. Wonder if she'll get to hang around a little bit longer than what she did in the comics. And if you're wondering why she died so quickly in the comics, that her debut was also her last appearance, it's because Anne is actually a latent mutant. She registered as a mutant on William Stryker's mutant detection device. And when that happened, well, just like how white supremacy backfires on white women, well, guess what being a mutant-hating human does for humans who turn out to be mutants? But it's also thanks to the Purifiers that we get a Black Panther reference. There is a moment where the Executioner brings up they have weapons that are vibranium based. It's a very clear nod to Black Panther, Wakanda, all that good stuff, which also, considering some of the things that happened in the previous season, Black Panther was alluded to, he was teased. So who knows? Maybe that will be something that gets paid off somewhere down the stretch. Now, next thing is going to be when we get to Polaris, after all the shenanigans with X Factor, when she returns to the Xavier school. When she goes to her room, she ends up reuniting with the rest of the X-Men. But there is one particular character who's wearing a shirt that is very much a nod to what is effectively one of the earliest Marvel Comics characters to ever receive a movie. And it's Howard the Duck. This little Easter egg is noteworthy for a couple of reasons. One of them being because this is taken from around the time of October the 26th, 1976, during Howard the Duck number 8. This is where Howard the Duck was running for president against Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford. And you would see the buttons, "Get Down America, vote Howard the Duck" in 76. It is also noteworthy because in 1979, a University of Virginia Student Council President hopeful ran as Howard the Duck during his election and oddly enough, won. even using a similar slogan as to what was used in Howard the Duck #8, why a duck? Why not? We've had turkeys running student government for years. Now, granted, Howard couldn't serve his term because, well, duh, fictional character, but yeah, this was a really fun Easter egg. Now, this next thing, we're going to talk about Danger for just a little bit. I mean, by a little bit, I mean probably for a lot of bit. For those unfamiliar, Danger is a character from the comics who made her debut back in, it was in and around 2004 during the Joss Whedon and John Cassaday Astonishing X-Men Volume 3 run. This was probably, by my estimation, one of the best X-Men runs that has ever been created. And I'm sad to say that because Joss Whedon is a whole piece of shit. And I'm not going to sit here and, and cope and say that Astonishing X-Men is bad, because it wasn't. It was great. But Danger is, for all intents and purposes, largely intact in X-Men 97 Season 2, but there are some subtle differences and some things that don't really get addressed. Now, in the X-Men 97 Season 2 Episode 6 episode Danger.exe, Danger is pretty much just the Danger Room, and she basically has just decided that the only way to make the X-Men better is to become their villain, more or less, and to actively push them to the next level, seeing that they're not strong enough to fight the forces that they need to fight at this moment. But in the comics, it's something a little bit more sinister. And it's that in the comics, Charles Xavier uses, this is what is effectively sentient Shi'ar technology in order to create the Danger Room. But the thing is, he knows that the technology is sentient, that it has individuality, that is, for all intents and purposes, no different than enslaving a human being. And being sentient, you would imagine that the Danger Room would develop a sense of dislike for the people that it's being enslaved by, whether some of them know it or not. And this is what ultimately leads to Danger gaining personhood and taking the fight to the Astonishing X-Men, and largely beats the brakes off of them for what is effectively almost 6 issues. The original storyline that this took place in Astonishing X-Men Volume 3, it basically ran from like issues 7 to 12, though one could make the argument that some of it kind of might have also started in issue 6, but ultimately issues 7 through 12 are the bulk of the story. And while the name of this episode is Danger.exe, the original story arc was titled Dangerous, but obviously Danger.exe, it is very much a nod to the character Danger. But outside of that, there are some interesting things going on with Danger in this, that yes, Charles Xavier is not being held to any type of misdeeds in regards to Danger's characterization in this story. Yes, you could make an argument, like you can infer in the argument that maybe Charles did enslave something that was actually sentient, but they never actually really shine a light on it the way they did in the Astonishing X-Men series, basically exonerating Charles of any wrongdoing. Because at this point, you want to keep Charles sympathetic, so they're not going to really go out of their way to do anything that's going to make him look worse than he probably already could up to this point. The X-Men the Animated Series and X-Men 97 have largely made Charles blameless in a lot of shit that he has done in the comics, and this right here is no different. Another interesting thing that pops up in this regarding Danger, and this one I'm gonna go into right now, is a little bit of a reach, and I'm gonna go ahead and clarify that now, just because, yeah, I'm not saying that it is the thing, but it's pretty close to it. Now, when you're looking through the eyes of Danger and seeing her heads-up display, her HUD, one of the things you might notice if you're as terminally dialed in to the X-Men's Krakoan era as I was, is that if you look on the right side of the screen, you'll notice some shapes and, things of that nature, and some of them, not saying it is, but some of them do look vaguely similar to the letters of the Krakoan alphabet. I'm not saying it is that, but it is interesting that they're that close, that they're as close as what they are. Another thing about Danger, and this one is, I talked a lot about how the previous episode of Weapon X Lies and DVDs did a lot of homages towards films like John Carpenter's The Thing and the Aliens franchise. Well, this episode is not necessarily getting away from that. When you look at how Danger is depicted prior to gaining her own body, one thing that becomes incredibly clear: somebody really liked 2001: A Space Odyssey. This is a Stanley Kubrick film that I believe came out in 1968, and this movie, while it is probably one of the most influential sci-fi films of all time, it is also a movie that has an artificial intelligence who goes off the rails. Yeah, and you look at Danger when she's just in this kind of circular lens form. It is very reminiscent of HAL 9000 from 2001. It's even more interesting that while the voices are obviously different because male voice versus female voice, but the cadence and the tone, the tenor of how Danger speaks prior to completely going into full-on villain mode, it's not exactly the same, but it's pretty similar. Like, they literally have Danger do everything but say,
"I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that."
We also get a very brief look at Danger's battle damage wing form from the Astonishing X-Men series. This is something that actually gets a little bit more panel time in the comics, but in this, we get kind of like just really quick shots of it. It's like it's something that happens, she gets the wing, she's battle damaged, but then like somewhere in the midst of that, like it's just really quick and you will miss it shots. You don't really get to spend a whole heap of a lot of time looking at her in this form, but it is there and it is literally ripped straight from the pages of Astonishing X-Men. Let's go into the next thing, and this is still going to kind of involve Danger, but this is where we get to the character Wing. Wing getting injured during the midway portion of this episode is not a random occurrence. This is actually from the very same Astonishing X-Men Volume 3 run, only this happens in issue 5 of that series. But fortunately for Wing, he actually comes out far better in this X-Men 97 Season 2 episode than he did in the comics. That's because he gets to survive the encounter with the Danger Room, which at the time, during Astonishing X-Men Volume 3, number 7, Danger tricked Wing into unaliving himself by getting him to jump off a ledge thinking he'd regain his powers. And this is all as a result of him having lost them on M-Day when the Scarlet Witch depowered most of the mutant population, all but 199 mutants. And Wing, unfortunately, was not one of them. Now, X-Men 97 has not been shy about showing off a bunch of random and sundry mutants, showcasing characters that they normally would not have time to delve too deep into. Well, this episode is no different. As a matter of fact, we see a lot of the same characters that we bear witness to in the second episode, A Force to be Reckoned With, earlier this season. However, we do get to see, by my count, a handful of mutants we don't normally get to see in X-Men 97. I'm not going to go through all the other ones because I'm going to be honest with you, pretty much every mutant that was showcased in this episode that was in the background, we have seen all of these characters, not just this season, but even in the previous season. I saw a lot of people commenting that, oh, this is the first time we've seen Dust or Nature Girl or anybody like that. And the reality is, we actually saw them in the first season. It's just that, once again, you kind of had to know where to look. Now, getting to this episode, the three characters we see that really have not gotten a lot of shine over the course of X-Men 97 are Shark Girl, Dupe, and the third character being the artist, formerly known as No Girl, now in the comics known as Sarah Bella. Now, granted, she is typically only referred to as Sarah Bella, once she gains a new body. But in the format she is currently in, and because there's a lot of Grant Morrison's X-Men, or rather Grant Morrison's new X-Men involved in this, she would technically be No Girl at this point. But just know that is not the name she goes by anymore. She is Cerebella in the comics and has been for like the past like 3, almost 4 years. Now, this next bit has to do with the character Storm. That's right, everybody's favorite mistress of the elements. And speaking of being a mistress of the elements, she is no longer just a mistress of the elements, she is a head mistress of the elements, but also the head mistress of the Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters. Now, the interesting part about this isn't something that's unique to X-Men 97. This is something that actually comes from the comics. Specifically, in 2013's Wolverine and the X-Men number 24, Storm took over as head mistress of the Jean Grey School for Higher Learning, following the stepping down of Kitty Pryde, who was head mistress at the time and was devoting her time to training the original Recipe X-Men that Beast brought back from the past. In a way, this kind of created a whole like full circle moment for all characters involved, because Storm was the character who was probably the most like apparent to Kitty Pryde when she first joined the X-Men. Kitty looked to her as if she was her mother. So the fact that Kitty Pryde became head mistress of the school and then passed that title on to Storm, basically making the person who effectively raised her as a mutant, basically took that moment, brought it full circle, and made Storm now the person who she trusted to lead the school in her wake. And then also at the same time, Kitty training the original Recipe X-Men, that being Cyclops, Beast, Angel, Jean Grey, and Iceman, training those characters who are about roughly the age she was when she first joined the X-Men, but these are the past versions of them, and then bringing them forward into the future, training them and getting them up to snuff. So yeah, it kind of created this whole full circle moment. And it was even full circled and then recircled again, because by the time of 2017, in X-Men Prime #1, Storm relinquished the title of head mistress of the Xavier Institute and gave it back to Kitty Pryde. And then Storm left the X-Men. This was all kind of in the fallout of Storm and Black Panther's dissolution of their marriage. Like, there was a whole bunch of crazy stuff that was going on around then, all the AVX, Avengers versus X-Men shenanigans. So yeah, it's kind of interesting that, we're getting Storm to that point where well, in this, she's technically not leader of the X-Men, but she is the person who's in charge of the school, not Charles Xavier. And that's because there's other stuff going on with Charles we'll get to here in just a moment. This is something that I was actually surprised by, because we got a lot of business from Morph in the previous episode, so you would imagine Morph probably not going to be doing a whole heap of a lot. They're tied up a little bit. They've gotten a lot of business, but the little we do see of them, they do still manage to give us one of those sneaky little greater Marvel Universe cameos. Whereas in the previous episode, they turned into the Thing very briefly, basically giving us that taste of the Fantastic Four. This episode, they give us another helping of Fantastic Four goodness by transforming into Reed Richards, aka Mr. Fantastic. Now, this makes a whole heap of a lot of sense, because Morph cannot replicate the powers of other people if they involve energy on any level. So the idea that the characters they have chosen to turn into, being the Thing and Mr. Fantastic, characters whose powers can be very easily replicated, it makes sense. Not to say they can't turn into the Invisible Woman or can't turn into the Human Torch, but I would imagine they would not be able to use their abilities on any level. So it would kind of be a waste of a transformation, just being real about it. Speaking of powers, we also get a nice little combination attack, almost kind of a Marvel Rivals style combination attack from Cyclops and Jean Grey in this episode. Now, this was something that was actually teased in the trailers for X-Men 97 Season 2, but there is something very interesting about this little attack that they do, where Jean Grey uses her telekinesis and telepathic abilities to create claws no different than Wolverine, and Cyclops shooting, basically channeling his optic blast through those psionic claws and spreading his beams across multiple different points. But the funny thing about that is, Cyclops actually doesn't need Jean to do that. We've actually seen Cyclops do this sort of thing in the comics and not really need anything other than his visor. Even more interesting is that Cyclops can not only split his beams, he can also curve and send out multiple beams to hit multiple different targets, and because he's a trigonometry whiz, he can also use his beam to bounce off of multiple different objects and even shoot through other prismatic type items to split the beam even further. Also, sidebar to the sidebar, when Danger reflects the beam back at both Jean Grey and Cyclops, the object that she turns her hand into is also the same prism she used to avoid a similar attack from Cyclops in Astonishing X-Men number 10. I don't think this was necessary, or at least the way you had to do this, I don't think was necessary, but it's the rule of cool. It looks cool, so everything else doesn't really matter to me. Speaking of Cyclops and Jean, this is also where we get our first real helping of the Grant Morrison era new X-Men costumes. We see both Cyclops, Jean, and Beast, as well as Xavier, rocking the costumes from that time frame. Rogue's costume, while not the same, is probably a little bit more reminiscent of something she would have worn during the Extreme X-Men, while Nightcrawler's costume is actually pretty close to the one he had when he did show up for the new X-Men run back in the early aughts. And while this is all going on, this is all actually framed under the guise of X-Corp. This was also another key point of the Grant Morrison era of new X-Men, where they introduced this non-profit organization whose whole purpose was to investigate civil rights violations against mutants. And it seems like this is something that is probably going to ramp up and maybe even start to rope Sunspot more into the shenanigans. Sunspot did play a pretty huge role as a part of X-Corp back during its early days. And while this initial outing of X-Corp is only in Genosha, built within the ruins of that massacre, this is something that did actually span out across the globe, where just like any corporation, they had offices all across the world. They had offices that ranged everywhere from India, Africa, France, Singapore, Australia, China, the Netherlands, and even multiple points across the United States of America. Now it's time to address the elephant in the room. I thought I'd save the absolute best for the absolute last, and that is this episode we see the return of Remy LeBeau, aka Gambit, who we sadly saw killed off back during the midway point of season 1. Here we see that Apocalypse is bringing him back to life, as was teased at the end of season 1, and brings him back in a way that is very reminiscent of Frankenstein's monster, laying him across a table and pulling a lever and electricity basically striking him and bringing him, jolting him back to life. But in this particular instance, something a little bit different is happening, because his way of doing it is not that dissimilar from what we have seen with Warren Worthington III, aka Angel, when Apocalypse first transformed him into Archangel, both in the comics and in the original animated series. Now, another thing that is of note is that Gambit looks a little bit different. And what I mean by different is that he kind of looks almost the same as he normally would. I say this because roughly around X-Men Volume 2, I believe this was in like issues 183, 84, 85, is where you kind of first start seeing Gambit being slowly transformed into becoming one of Apocalypse's 4 horsemen, specifically becoming Death. In that particular instance, Gambit had very different colored skin. Back during that time frame, Gambit's skin was almost kind of like a off-black color. You basically, depending on who was providing color for the book, his skin was either jet black or it was kind of like this kind of sallow, almost grayish color, depending on how lighting and everything was being utilized in the moment. Now here, they have opted for something different. This reason is probably not as obvious, but it was probably because it didn't look good in animation. Not everything that looks good in a still frame looks good in motion. This is something we've heard a lot of times in regards to film when it came to how comic accurate costumes used to be back in the early aughts and even into the 2010s, where, one of the biggest criticisms of Wolverine's costume is that they couldn't figure out a way to make his iconic mask work in a 3D setting, and they eventually ended up figuring it out, obviously, by the time we got to Deadpool and Wolverine. And we've seen this for a lot of other stuff, but I think it was probably one of those things where it probably wasn't the most animator-friendly design. I talked about this before in regards to why they changed the Brood in the original X-Men the Animated Series when they introduced them as the Colony and kind of dumbed down their design. Though in some respects you can make an argument maybe they made it more complex in some regards, but that's another story altogether. Now, the other reason, this one's probably more obvious, is because it's effectively just Gambit in blackface. I mean, it's not exactly that, but I mean, he's a white guy. Let's just keep it a buck. He's white and his skin is suddenly black. I'm pretty sure Disney just didn't want the smoke on that one. I mean, look at what Disney did with the episode of Community when they were playing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, where Kim Jong was dressed up as a dark elf, and they were like, yep, get that off of there. Which, granted, not the best look, but it was one of those where I was like, I'm not as offended by this as maybe some other people are. But point is, that's also probably a very clear reason why they didn't do that. And who knows, maybe they make it something where it only happens sometimes with him. It could still happen, you never know. Now, the last thing I want to talk about in regards to Gambit is during his transformation, we see his iconic playing cards transform right along with him. Now, I'm going to go through these and I'm going to have to kind of read some of the stuff off because not all of this I committed to memory. But when you look at Gambit's playing cards, the first one, and let's get that one, the obvious one out of the way, is his Queen of Hearts, the very card that he was holding on to in that 5th episode of season 1, the very card that Apocalypse found when he discovered Gambit's body. Well, when we see that card during his transformation, we see that card turn into a tarot card, just like all the others. But this one goes from being a Queen of Hearts to the Lovers. And not only does this become the Lovers card, but we literally see Gambit and Rogue depicted on the card. Now, this is important, and I'm going to use the most basic of reading with this. I don't profess to be a tarot card reader, but I will just say just the stuff I do know about this. With the Lovers card, since the card is upright, and I think, these things are important because a tarot card's orientation can completely change what its meaning is. Now, since this card is upright, it is basically letting us know that Gambit and Rogue will eventually get back together. That is what the Lovers card typically represents just by itself. The rekindling of passion and partnership and relationship, romanticism. That's typically what that entails, and considering his relationship with Rogue was on the out before everything happened, it was in a weird place, let's be honest with ourselves. It is interesting that's one of the cards that comes up for him. The next card we see is Death. Now, Death, duh, because Gambit is now the Horseman of Death. But if we're talking about the actual tarot meaning of it, in tarot, death does not necessarily mean that someone is going to die. That is something that I feel like movies and really just popular media have kind of like perverted. Death does not necessarily mean that someone is going to actually literally die. The Death tarot card, when it is upright, often means that someone is about to experience great change or transformation, transition, a new beginning of some sort. And let's be honest with ourselves, Gambit just got the motherload of all of those. He's a newly christened Horseman of the Apocalypse. He's transitioned from death back to life. He's been transformed into a new darker state of being, and he's now effectively an X-Men villain. That's the very definition of the tarot card of death. The other major tarot card we see is the Tower. Now, the Tower upright can mean chaos, destruction, sudden upheaval and trauma, and even confusion, pain, and tragedy. Even sudden revelation. All of these are very likely going to play a pivotal part, and in a lot of cases have already played a pivotal part in Gambit's transition to becoming the Horseman of Death. And what instances of this we haven't seen play out are probably all going to be laid bare in episode 8, Dead Man's Hand. But one of them is particularly noteworthy because it has a lot to do with Apocalypse's own namesake. Now, I would forgive a lot of people for just automatically assuming Apocalypse is named Apocalypse because he's supposed to be the literal end of all things, but the reality is Apocalypse has a much deeper meaning when you go by the original Greek translation. Apocalypse does not mean the end of the world. The original Greek definition of apocalypse is basically meant to reveal, to uncover, lifting the veil and revealing a hidden truth. So for all intents and purposes, Apocalypse's namesake doesn't mean the end of the world, it actually means revelation. Even more interesting because very recently in the comics, in the last year or two, Apocalypse did actually change his name from being Apocalypse to being Revelation. Not that that's gonna play any major role in this, it's just something really fun to think about. Now, there are other cards that are revealed, one of which is kind of difficult to tell exactly what it is, but the other two, I can definitely tell you what they are. I'm gonna start with the one I'm less certain about just to go ahead and get it out of the way. But once again, it's iffy because the card is actually more blurry than the other two cards that are revealed, so it could either be a Two of Cups or it could be a Two of Wands. It really depends on artistic license, if I'm keeping it a buck with you. But if it is a Two of Cups upright, that can be a nod towards passion, love, and compatibility, as well as a balance and partnership, which would be on brand for what's going on with Gambit. Yeah, as far as his relationship with Rogue, it would coincide with the Lover's card. Now, the other card it could potentially be is a Two of Wands, and if it's Two of Wands, that could mean that he is about to make a huge decision or take a big risk, even explore a new opportunity. And that seems very much in line with what's going on with Gambit in this particular episode, as far as his transformation and what is to come. He has a new opportunity. Is Gambit just going to throw himself wholeheartedly into it? And more importantly, is he going to take a major risk in regards to his new status as the Horseman of Death? And we're actually going to be talking about this here in just a moment with one of these other cards. The next card is going to be the Ace of Pentacles, which upright typically means a new job or business opportunity, sometimes even financial gain. I'm not really 100% sure about this one or how it actually plays into anything, but I mean, if you kind of look at it, it also does coincide with the previous card of the Tower. And that is where we get to the Five of Swords. The Five of Swords upright in tarot could be a hint at how Gambit will be turned around, because the upright version of the Five of Swords means impending defeat and even self-sabotage, as well as defending oneself. And I think there is a universe where I could see Gambit realize that he's about to hurt one of the people that he loves, and that being Rogue. I have a feeling that's going to be the key to turning him around, to get him to change his ways, so to speak. Now, this last card is the Three of Pentacles, which upright means teamwork and collaboration. Likely a nod towards the people who are going to be working closely with Gambit, because once again, he is the Horseman of Death. Where are the other three? We know War has already been killed off, and the other two probably aren't that far behind him, but we know Apocalypse loves his Horseman of Death. And during the time frame around X-Men Volume 2, number 180-ish, that was actually where Apocalypse was formulating a new Horseman of the Apocalypse to go alongside his newly collected Gambit. The remaining Horsemen were actually Gazer, Sunfire, and Polaris, a character who has been hanging around a lot this season. Now, I don't think Polaris is going to get drugged into this, but once again, you never know. X-Men 97 has been kind of flying through storylines, so who knows? And there has been this whole thing about whether or not Polaris is fated to become like her father. And I feel like that storyline has been put to bed, but you never know. They could go back to it. Anyway, that's everything that you probably missed in X-Men 97 Season 2, Episode 6, Danger.exe. If you enjoyed this video, make sure that you hit that like button because YouTube will show you way more videos just like it. And also, make sure if you enjoyed this video, hit that subscribe button and tap that notification bell. That way you don't miss out on any of my videos. And if you really want to help the channel out, use the new hype feature and become part of my hype squad. That is going to help boost this video in the leaderboards and get it out to even more people. Anyway, thank you all so much for taking the time to watch this video, and I'll see you all next time. Keep it plus ultra till then. We out of here. Peace out.